Hi, this is Heather. In this video, I'm going to briefly introduce neoliberalism and introduce the idea also that we might be moving beyond. The learning outcomes for this section of the class is to develop a really high-level understanding of neoliberalism as a dominant social and political narrative beginning in the 1980s. We're also going to look at the impact of neoliberalism on the information professions and look at contemporary critique of neoliberalism from the perspective of radical librarians and also from major economists. Then we'll look at the potential for other rapid shifts in ideas about how society ought to work. In other words, if ideas about how our society can change this quickly from the 1970s to 1980s, and people are thinking this is the end of the neoliberal era, for future information professionals, the question is, what will come next? Barron, the reason we have this reading for this week is in critiquing neoliberalism. Barron also talks a little bit about what neoliberalism is. So here's a definition that markets are efficient and the state and public sector do not have a role to play in economic development aside from assisting the private sector, basically. So a few of the history and characteristics of neoliberalism. This began in the 1980s. We saw a radical shift in thinking about how societies were to work, beginning with Margaret Thatcher in the UK and her opposition to the nanny state, and Reaganomics in the US. This is characterized basically by a belief in the free market or laissez-faire capitalism, minimal government services and regulations, privatization of the public sector, and austerity. Neoliberalism since the 1980s has been spread pretty much around the globe. And why? It's because of the Washington Consensus, as it's called. And that's because some very powerful players in the world, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the U.S. Department of the Treasury were believers in neoliberalism, and so they imposed neoliberal policies such as austerity, cutting government services on the developing world. Barron talks a little bit about some of the impact of neoliberalism on the information professions. We can see this in the emphasis on market-oriented solutions. We talk about customers or consumers as opposed to library patrons, coffee shops, branding, all that kind of stuff. Just a few other suggestions of my own of what we're seeing as the information professions beginning in the 1980s began to adjust to the neoliberal era. Public library directors began to refer to themselves as chief executive officers. We've seen an example of focus on market-oriented accountability, that we want to see a return on investment in our services we provide as libraries or information professionals. An emphasis on cost recovery, the idea that the user should pay for their services. Libraries and other information professionals have developed services for pay, such as business research. And we've seen some privatization. For example, in the US, there has been a trend to privatizing libraries. I think that may have passed its heyday. But we're seeing consultants rather than just public sector employees. For information professionals, this provides opportunities as well as challenges. For us, for example, some of the grads of our program would work in some of the consulting services. are we moving beyond neoliberalism? So Barron is speaking from the perspective of radical librarianship, talking about how we want to move away from where we were in the neoliberal era and refocus on our ethical roots, such as respect for the individual and individual freedom, social responsibility, and organizational obligations. But it's not just radical librarians who are critiquing neoliberalism nowadays. It's also major economists such as Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize winning economist who's actually stated neoliberalism is dead. So this is from an article in a UK business newspaper, and Stiglitz is quoted as saying that one of the central tenets of neoliberal ideology, that markets function best when they're left alone, and that an unregulated regulated market is the best way to increase economic growth, has now been pretty much disproved. This is the International Monetary Fund. They've made three disquieting conclusions. Okay, so the International Monetary Fund was part of the Washington's consensus that globalized and imposed neoliberal policies on countries throughout the world. And some of the economists associated with the International Monetary Fund are making points such as, well, actually, it doesn't seem to work. Basically, we predicted increased growth. We can't really find any evidence that's happening. There's a huge cost in terms of increasing inequality. And in fact, the increased inequality hurts the level and sustainability of growth. So the International Monetary Fund has been going to countries throughout the world in the last few decades and telling them to implement austerity policies, to quit paying for government services, with the idea that this is going to foster economic growth. And some economists, not all, but some of them who are very much in those circles, are now saying, this doesn't seem to be working. Okay, so if economists are beginning to say, well, neoliberalism is dead, does this mean that it's going away? No, because neoliberalism has been a very successful meta-narrative or ideology about how our society ought to work. So if you were born since the 1980s, or if you're a little kid in 1980, these ideas that we need to rely on the free market, nothing should impede the free market, we need deregulation, have been common sense in our society for the last few decades since you were little. That means that even though economists might think that this is dead but still dominant, there's many people, including information professionals, people in senior positions in the organizations that we serve, and politicians who we need to fund our services. Neoliberal ideas might still be just plain common sense. So even though the ideology or the academic background of this is not something that people believe in anymore, it's still something that very much influences our work environment. So in conclusion, why do we need to learn about neoliberalism? We need to understand the origin of some of our common sense ideas so that we can critically reflect on these ideas. Now, critiquing neoliberalism doesn't mean there are no good ideas in neoliberalism. What it means is that as an ideology, we can be critical and say which are the ideas that we might want to keep into the future and which are the ones that we might want to ditch. Now, if major economists are beginning to say, whoa, this doesn't work, this might be another time, like the 1980s, where we might begin to see new meta-narratives emerge. So in the past few decades, information professionals have adjusted to neoliberalism, and so my question is, what will become common sense in the future during your careers? I don't have the answer for that, but it's important to think about that those big ideas meta-narratives about how our society works or should work do change and can change incredibly rapidly, and you guys might need to go through a shift and adjustment to new kinds of ideas within the scope of your careers.